We are starting a new series today. We're calling it Faith 101. The idea with Faith 101 is to kind of go with some of the basics of our belief. And I want to encourage you guys to ask questions, not during the sermon, but I encourage you guys, if you have questions about anything Bible-related, faith-related, write them down, text them to me, send me a message, whatever it might be. And we'll take a couple Sundays out during this series to answer those questions. If your kids have questions about this, I would love to answer those as well. I don't care how silly they are. If they sound silly to you, even better. We'll talk through them and we'll answer them. It's important for us to go through that. The basic idea for me with this is the KISS method, which is keep it short and simple, or as I know it, keep it simple, stupid. That's how I go by it. So I'm going to try not to go too terribly deep into things. I want to touch the surface, the basics of faith, and then if there's questions that come up with that, please feel free to come and ask me. But before we start our Faith 101, something I want to do, and I'm hoping to do this several times during our series here, is to play a little game that I like to call, Is It in the Bible or Not? And so I'm going to give you guys some quotes, and you have to determine if it's in the Bible or not. Now, if you recognize it for what it is, please don't tell the people around you, like, oh, I know that's from such and such. Let's play the game together. Are you guys ready? All right, let's start with this one. I think it's a fairly easy one. Is this in the Bible or not? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. How many of you think that's in the Bible? Raise your hand. How many of you don't think it's in the Bible? Awesome. Good work, guys. Yes, that is John 3:16. So we got that one figured out. Our next one. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. How many of you think that is in the Bible? Raise your hand. How many of you think that's not in the Bible? A lot more nots, but how many of you have no idea and you don't want to commit to anything? Good work. This is not in the Bible. Does anybody know right off the bat who said this? Yoda. Absolutely.
Your thoughts dwell on your mother.
I miss her.
Afraid to lose her, I think.
What has that got to do with anything?
Everything. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Star Wars Episode 1 is good for something. So, our next quote. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. How many of you think that is in the Bible? Raise your hand. I got one brave soul saying they think it's in the Bible. How many of you think it's not in the Bible? All right, anybody know what this is from? This is not in the Bible. So looking this up, I know this from a movie called The Usual Suspect.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
So that's from The Usual Suspects. I did look this up online. Originally, that's apparently from 19th century French author Charles Baudelaire. Never read anything from this guy, but that's okay. Our next one. A little bit longer, I'll read it for you. I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of night. I have taken off my robe. Must I put it on again? I have washed my feet. Must I soil them again? My beloved thrust his hand through the latch opening. My heart began to pound for him. Valentine's Day is this week, so I thought I'd throw something like that in there. How many of you think this is from the Bible? A couple people. How many of you think this is not in the Bible? How many of you don't want to commit again? So this is from Song of Songs. Some of you figured that out. Yes, this is from the Bible. Some of those things we might not think are in the Bible really are there. This is an interesting book to read. I I would say if you want poetry for your Valentine, this would be great, but I'm 42 and I'm a bachelor, so I don't know what I'm talking about anyway. Let's start to talk about Faith 101 today. Today we're going to start with this great truth from the book of Romans. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I do want to start with a quick little informational thing. When you're reading the Bible, there are some words that are great to look for that are connecting words. Therefore, for, but, and, yet, so. If you remember your English class from high school, junior high, those are all called conjunctions. Conjunctions join what was said before with what is going to be said afterwards. They're connecting words. When you see one of these words, it helps us to put into context what is being said with what was just said, with the verses that we just read. And so our focus today is on Romans 3:23, which says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." The "for" in this verse tells us to look at the previous verse to help us understand this one a little better. You guys with me on that? Right? Context. So I'm going to back up just a little bit and start reading in the middle of verse 22. Paul says, "There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Does anybody know when this letter to the Romans was written? Does anybody want to take a guess? What? A long time ago. You are absolutely correct. You've won the contest. This was written around 55 to 57 AD, CE, however you want to say the word, the time frame. This is about 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And there would have been a belief at this time among Jewish people, which Paul was previously. If you remember, Paul was a Pharisee before his encounter with Jesus. There would have been a belief among Jewish people at this time that the Jews were righteous, that they had this covenant with God, that all these works that they did gave them a good relationship with God. The circumcision, the sacrifices, the food purity laws. If they did these things, if they followed all these rules, they were on God's good side. But all those Gentiles, anyone that was not Jewish, was unclean. They were not on God's good side. To really, really oversimplify this, Jews were good, Gentiles were bad, at least from the Jewish perspective. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to try to keep things fairly simple as we go, but sometimes we got to take a little bit of a deeper dive, and I'm going to do that now briefly. The overall picture of what Paul is saying is that for Jews from the time of Abraham up until the time of Jesus, it wasn't really the good works that got them on God's good side. It wasn't because of the circumcision. It wasn't because of the sacrifices and so on. They were on God's good side because of their faith in God. A little bit later in Romans, in chapter 4, Paul says essentially that Abraham was justified by his faith, not by his works. There was that, and frankly, God went easy on his people, on the people that he loved. Back to 3:23, all have sinned. Paul is saying that someone isn't righteous or good simply because they're Jewish. Someone isn't unrighteous or bad simply because they're Gentile, because they're not Jewish. All people have sinned and fall short of God's glory. Now, how does this apply to us today? Let's make sure we're all on the same page here, right? Sin equals bad. Do you agree with that? Okay, good. We can continue then. Sin is bad. None of us like to think of ourselves as bad people. I know I don't. None of us like to think of those that we love as bad people. And we don't usually have a problem admitting in a fairly general sense that we will occasionally do bad things. I'm not a bad person, but there are times when I will do something bad. That admission of I will sometimes do something bad is often followed by one of two other things, or possibly both of these things. The first is that we don't admit to anything specific. Sure, we do bad things, but we don't pinpoint that specific bad act that we've done. Conversation might go something like this. Well, I'm not a bad person. Yeah, I've done some bad things, but I'm not a bad person. You literally just stole a candy bar and you're eating it right now. Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm not a bad person. I just, I kind of, you trailed off there. I know that's a terrible example, but I couldn't come up with anything better. But do you see what I'm kind of going for here? Is we don't like to admit the specific sin itself. We'll admit in a more general sense that we sin. We'll admit in a more general sense that we have bad things in us, but when it comes to identifying the specific sin, the specific bad thing, we tend to be hesitant to see it. That's the first thing we do in our admission of sinfulness. The second thing, which might be significantly more dangerous to us, is comparison. Comparison is dangerous. Yes, I do bad things, but they aren't really all that bad in the grand scheme of things. It's not like I've ever murdered anybody. Or, well, yes, I do bad things. Yes, I sin. But man, that guy over there, you should see the bad things he did. I'm nowhere near as bad as that guy. My sins aren't as bad as they could be, so I should be excused. Or, my sins aren't as bad as that other person's sins, so I should be excused. Here's why that argument falls short. I'm going to ask you guys another question, and I urge you not to raise your hand and not to outwardly answer this question in any way. We're not in a court of law, and I'm not a law-talking guy, and this is still America, and you have a right against self-incrimination. Okay? Who among you has committed murder? Don't raise your hand. Who among you has committed murder? Just answer it in your head. In Exodus, God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. In most modern translations, one of those commandments is, you shall not murder. In some translations, including the King James, it says, you shall not kill. King James says, thou shalt not kill. But you shall not kill. And so there's some debate going on in some circles about whether the Hebrew word here should be translated as murder or kill. That there's a difference between murder and killing. We'll say killing can be justified in some circumstances. In self-defense, if someone intends to kill you or someone else, you can kill that person first. In war, if you're a soldier in war, killing is understood and acceptable and justifiable. Legal executions. If a person is convicted of a crime and the state determines the crime warrants execution, it's okay and even necessary to kill that person. Murder, however, is simply killing for no justifiable reason. I'm angry at you, I hate you, I'm going to end your life. Well, if you're Jewish, that's a legitimate discussion to have. Anybody here Jewish? It's not illegal to be Jewish, you can answer that. But if you're Jewish, it's a legitimate question to ask. But if you're Christian, this argument is pointless because Jesus already settled the argument. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, this is from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Raka in here is a statement of contempt. If you call someone a fool, if you have contempt for someone, if you hate someone, you are guilty of violating this commandment. You are guilty of committing murder. Not from a legal standpoint of the state. Kansas is not going to prosecute you if you call someone a fool, but you are guilty in the eyes of God. You have done this bad thing. You have felt contempt for someone. You have hated someone. You have called someone a fool. We have all done this bad thing. We have all committed murder. We have all sinned. I'm sure most of you remember the presidential election of 1976, right? Everybody remembers that one. 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected as president, and frankly, it doesn't matter what your political views are on Jimmy Carter, or frankly, any other politician or political candidate. Those opinions have nothing to do with Jesus Christ. Jimmy Carter is a devout Christian man. This is a man who lived his life following the teachings of Jesus. His post-presidency work, especially with Habitat for Humanity, is very, very well known. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was interviewed by, we'll call it a popular men's magazine, and I'm going to leave it at that. The interview, which can be found several places online, if you're interested, just be careful when you look for it. In this interview, Carter makes what seems to be a very stunning admission. He said he committed adultery. Again, one of the 10 commandments is you shall not commit adultery. And in 1976, in the middle of a presidential campaign, Carter admitted fully to breaking this commandment. How could he do such a thing? How could he cheat on his wife and a Christian man, no less? But that's not what he said. He didn't say he was cheating on his wife. He said he committed adultery. So what's the difference? Again, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Carter knew what Jesus said about this. Carter knew he was guilty of violating this commandment based on what Jesus said about it. And every one of us is guilty as well. I don't think Jesus means just men can be guilty of this. Women can be guilty of lust as well. There's a movie that came out a few years ago. What was it, Magic Mike, right? I didn't see it. It was not about me at all. Thankfully. Now remember, Jesus is God. Jesus is God. He is not changing any of the 10 commandments here. He is clarifying them, but he is not changing them. Jesus says we are all guilty of murder. Jesus says we are all guilty of adultery. And I believe Jesus means to give us a twofold message here. The first part of this message is don't hate people. Don't have contempt for people. Don't call someone a fool. Don't look at someone lustfully. Well, what's really wrong with those things? You don't like everybody. I know that. I don't like everybody. It happens. But what's wrong with hating and having contempt for someone, calling them a fool, lusting after someone? It's because it turns that person from a person into an object. You take a person, a human, fully formed in God's image, and you turn them into an object, which is removing that image of God from them in your eyes. And I think that's the big problem with these things. We turn them into an object of our scorn, an object of our loathing. We turn them into an object to be used, rather than a human being who is made in God's loving image. I think that's really what's wrong with these things. So Jesus says, don't hate, don't have contempt, don't look at someone lustfully. That's the first part of that bit of the message. The second part of the message from Jesus, though, is him saying, but guys, I know you're still going to do it. I know despite your best efforts, you are going to violate these commandments. Because hate and contempt and lust are part of who we are as fallen, sinful human beings. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In his letter, James, the brother of Jesus, says this, for whoever keeps the whole law, yet stumbles at just one point, is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said you shall not commit adultery also said you shall not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. That's from James chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. If you've broken One part of the law, you've broken all of it. And our normal human emotions and reactions cause us to break the law. They cause us to sin. If we all sin, if we have all violated the Ten Commandments, does that mean we have no hope? We're just doomed? We're destined for hell? Have a great day. Goodbye? Can't end it like that, can we? Of course not. Now, I know the first step in addiction recovery is to admit that you have a problem, right? Whatever the addiction is, admit that it is an addiction for you. And I think that's the first step for us as well as sinners. Don't make excuses. Don't write it off as, well, it's not as bad as it could be, or it's not as bad as that guy over there. Should see what he's doing. Acknowledge that you are part of the all. All have sinned. Now, there's nothing we can do on our own to overcome our sin, and we'll talk about that more in the upcoming weeks. There isn't any good deed you can do to erase a sin that we've committed. We can't go back in time and undo anything. You're a sinner. I'm a sinner. But we can all be forgiven through Christ Jesus if we would only believe. Do you believe? Do you admit that you are a sinner? Do you believe that Jesus came to earth from heaven? Do you believe that he lived a fully human, fully God, fully divine life? Do you believe that he willingly gave himself over to be crucified? Do you believe that he died on the cross? Do you believe that he rose again on the third day? Do you believe that? Do you acknowledge that Jesus is your Lord? Say it out loud. Jesus is my Lord.